It's a privilege to have you back. I think all of us were really dismayed to see the way in which all of this very hard work that you and your fellow commissioners had put in, the community members in the state of California, the hearings that you had talked with us about previously, the real in-depth work that you all had done for, it feels like going back a couple of years now, to see it all sort of come to a head the way that it did was really pearl clutching for a number of us. And now that I'm one of the commissioners on the New York State Commission for Reparations, I'm as much as I want to talk about this for the people to know, I'm also like, sis, how do we prevent that from happening in New York? So talk to us about what was the culmination of the work of the commission and what happened once your report and your recommendations left the hands of the commission and went to the state, and bring us up to speed as to where things lie now.
Sure. So as you all may know, California is the first state to create a reparations commission to not only study, but to also develop reparation proposals for African Americans with special consideration for descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. The statute that created that task force was signed into law by Governor Gavin Newsom, October 2020. And so the task force, essentially, we ran from June 2021 to June 2023. And we were a legislative advisory body. So our only power, so to speak, over the course of those 2 years was to advise the state legislature on the types of reparation proposals that they should turn into legislation, and that then Governor Newsom should sign into law. So in terms of the work product or the outcomes of this 2-year commission, we produced a 500-page interim report at the end of our first year of our work, which really was a catalog of all the atrocities and essentially the discrimination against African Americans in the state of California. And our final work product, so to speak, was a final report, which was 1,100 pages, which reproduced the first 500 pages of atrocities, but the remaining chapters mainly covered the over 200 plus policy recommendations that we recommended to the state legislature to adopt. And so the last date of our task force was June 29th, 2023. That's when we had our last hearing, but it officially sunsetted a few days after that, July 31st, 2023. And so from July 31st, 2023 to now, you really had, the state legislature, essentially the commission passed the baton to the state legislature, but particularly, it was the California Legislative Black Caucus, right? The Black legislators within the state legislature that really took that baton and, essentially took it upon themselves, took the initiative to introduce this first set of reparations bills in the state legislature based on the task force's recommendations. And so I'm happy to continue going.
Well,
But
so
essentially
at this point, you all have done your work. You've done the hearings. You've got the investigation. You've recounted the atrocities. You've pushed this forward to the legislature. The Black Caucus members of the California State Legislature take that baton, that heavy baton. There was a lot of work in that report. I don't know because I looked at it. I took that baton, and then their job was to do what?
Yes. So their job was to read the report, review the report, study the report, particularly the recommendations side of the report, the policy recommendations, and out of the 200 or so, pick out the ones that they wanted to introduce first and introduce them as legislation. And so that's what they did at the top of this year, at the top of 2024. They had a press conference at the end of January introducing their reparations priority bill package, which included 14 bills based on some of the task force's work. And then also you had State Senator Stephen Bradford, who was also the vice chair of the California Legislative Black Caucus. He introduced bills independent of the caucus, but still they were also reparations bills. So between the Black Caucus as a unit and Senator Bradford individually, we had about 19 or 20 or so actually reparations bills introduced at the top of this year. Where we are right now, though, and we can talk about kind of what happened August 31st, which essentially was, there were a lot of community support for two reparations bills in particular that would have created a reparations agency and a reparations fund, particularly for descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. Those were two bills that Bradford introduced individually outside of the caucus. Those two bills, were successful throughout the entire legislative process. However, at the very last minute, you had the California Legislative Black Caucus essentially kind of reneging on their commitment to introduce those two bills to the Assembly floor for a final vote. And that would have been actually the last step before it would have gone to Governor Newsom's desk to consider whether to sign or veto. So just to conclude.
Go ahead. Give us your conclusion on that point.
Well, I was just gonna say at the top of the year, there were 20 reparations bills. Where we are now, 9 or so of the CLBC's 14 reparations bills passed through all the legislative hurdles, and they're currently on Governor Newsom's desk for consideration whether to sign or veto. And he has until September 30th to figure out whether he's going to sign or veto the Black Caucus's bills that passed through the legislative hurdles. And then, unfortunately, personally, Bradford's bills that create the reparations agency and fund, they were put on the inactive file by the Black Caucus this year. And so, community organizers are working to put appropriate pressure on the Black Caucus to reintroduce those two bills in the next legislative session. They get back to work in less than 90 days. And I believe some Black Caucus members have already committed to at least introducing the reparations agency bill, but we'll see about the fund bill.
So for people who might not necessarily understand the minutia, this body, the Legislative Black Caucus, introduced bills based on your recommendations. And then there was another state senator who also introduced independent separate bills. A total of 20 bills at the top of the year have now been whittled down to about 9. And of some of the bills that the state Black Caucus introduced, they themselves then blocked those bills from advancing to where they could make it their way to Governor Gavin Newsom's desk. Am I restating that correctly?
For the most part. So for the reparations agency bill and the fund bill, as you mentioned, yes, those were bills independently introduced by Bradford. And at first, the Black Caucus actually was not in support of those two bills, particularly the agency bill. Okay. Whatever reason, I think one of the reasons they cited was, they felt as if Bradford should have helped introduce those bills with the Black Caucus. We can get into that a bit later, but the main point is, even though at the top of the year they weren't supportive, at least of the agency bill, I guess around May of 2024, they actually endorsed the agency bill and included it as part of their reparation priority bill package. So instead of 14 bills they endorsed, they included the agency bill. So that was the 15th bill that they endorsed. And actually, in May as well, there was a letter that was, I guess, leaked by a journalist a few days ago that stated it was a letter from the Black Caucus to the governor's administration requesting $6 million out of $12 million that Newsom has recently allocated in next year's budget for reparations legislation implementation. In that letter, the Black Caucus asked for $6 million of that $12 million to go to the reparations agency. They said it was a critical part of the final report, a critical part of reparations in the state. And then they also asked for $6 million to go to a nonprofit foundation, the California Black Freedom Fund, which we can get into later as well if we have time.
But I'm curious as to because for a lot of folks, once they first heard about what's happening in California, they thought all hope was lost, that all the fight for reparations is over. But you are here telling us that no, there are actually still bills that are moving forward. Some of the bills that were rendered inactive might actually get another shot in the next cycle. So you all, for those people who are fighting on the ground for reparations to move forward, this is still a very active thing. This is not something that because the news was insane. It was insane. It was intense. And so a lot of people came away thinking, oh, well, that was great. Now reparations is done. It sounds like, no, you're closing the door in one particular phase, but now you're in full on active pressure, your legislator mode. From your perspective as someone who served on the commission, what are your thoughts about the way this process has culminated? And what can you tell us about this, I don't know if it's a struggle for territory between the state Black Caucus and the state senator. Why, and is there a way for the state senator's agency to still make its way through to Gavin Newsom's desk for signature and to be signed into law?
Right. So not right now, because, the Black Caucus, again, at the last minute, decided to put the agency bill on the inactive file. So, and Senator Bradford is actually terming out. He served 14 years in the state legislature. Wow. So it's going to take a new, Black caucus member to reintroduce those bills essentially on Bradford's behalf. However, because there's been a lot of acrimony amongst the community about what happened the last week of the state legislature, about the Black caucus's kind of role in putting these transformative bills on the inactive file. There's been tons of community town halls across the state around this, where community organizers have actually invited Black caucus members to share their side of the story, so to speak. Black caucus members have gone on various different media appearances. And that's what I'm citing in those public statements they've made. They've made at least a commitment to reintroduce Bradford's reparations agency bill, but we still haven't heard any recommitment from any of them to reintroduce Bradford's reparations fund bill. That bill, if it had passed, would have created a new account in the state treasury to fund reparations programs, policies for descendants of slaves. And so kind of where I stand as a former chair of the California Reparations Task Force about this process, look, this is a historic moment, right? California is really leading the nation in, as I said earlier, not only studying this issue, but acting on this issue. And so, I mean, it's just amazing that, so much action has come out of this process thus far in terms of 20 or odd reparations and racial equity bills coming out of this process. However, I had a conversation with, public intellectual Mark Lamont Hill about this recently, and he said something really poignant, probably better than I could ever say it, in terms of the Black caucus's decision to abandon the reparations agency and fund bill, but to promote some of the other bills, which I guess you could say are more racial equity bills than reparations bills. And we can talk about that later. But essentially what Mark Lamont Hill said, we want to invest in urban communities. We want to invest in Black communities, but we need to be careful not to confuse that with reparations, right? We talk about reparations, we're talking about something specific and targeted redress, right? Whether that be direct cash payments to descendants of slaves, free college tuition to descendants of slaves at public colleges and universities, and private universities. He went on to say, let's essentially, we want to make sure, yes, the trimmings need to be there in terms of racial equity, but let's not leave off the bird itself. And reparations is that bird. And so that's my only critique about this process is whereas, racial equity bills are great. We have tons of racial equity policies in our final report, but we were a reparations task force. And so I'm looking for more transformative and substantive and specific targeted bills in this next legislative session.
And so just for people who are following along, the idea that you could have something that deals with racial equity as distinct from something that deals with reparations, how did the commission or the task force rather, did you all grapple with that question? And how did you distinguish between what was racial equity versus what would be reparations?
We did. We grappled with that a lot during the task force, during our public hearings. And we grappled with it in terms of trying to figure out how to organize the final report. There were, folks like myself and community organizers who were, utilizing public comment to say that the report needs to be organized in a specific way, put all the reparations policies that are specifically targeted to descendants of slaves, because again, the full title of our task force gave special consideration to descendants of slaves. So our argument was put those policies in one bucket and then put the more race-based and even universal policies that we also recommended in another bucket. However, they're kind of all mixed up, to be quite honest. I think there is Chapter 17 in our final report, which deals with compensation. And so that is, obviously targeted to descendants of slaves. And then the agency, there's a chapter that talks about the Freedmen Affairs Agency and how that would be set up. That was specifically targeted to descendants of slaves in the report. But the rest of the, over 100 recommendations, they're all mixed up. So there's universal policies in one bullet point, then you'll see race-based policies in another, and descendant-based policies in another. So to me, this is a democratic process. It was 9 members, even though I was chair, I didn't have any outsized power in that regard. So if it were up to me, there would have been better organization around that in our final report, but that wasn't necessarily the case. So it's kind of all over the place.
So this is something that it's been fascinating to watch, and thank you so much for explaining that distinction. It's been fascinating to watch from this side of the pond, or this side of the land, I should say, because one of the challenging things that people who are grappling with the notion of reparations also have to deal with are sort of what has been described as a nativist stream or a nativist thread that has sort of woven its way through some of the discourse. How are you all as a commission able to grapple with this idea that we're talking about reparations? And in New York, it might be somewhat differently because we're charged with looking at not just the impact of enslavement, but what happened after enslavement as well. So I don't know if you all had that same charge in your commission work, but how were you able to grapple with this idea that there is a real passionate discourse? Some might say astroturfed and artificial, but for some people, it's a very passionate form of discourse that looks at whether or not a reparations package should include specifically those who can trace their lineage back to the enslavement here in this country, as opposed to a reparations approach or framework that looks at not just people who were enslaved here in this country, but people who were also perhaps came here after enslavement for a variety of reasons and who are still dealing with the impact of racial discrimination, which has its roots in enslavement. Talk to us about how you were able to grapple with that tension.
Yeah, we definitely grapple with that tension a lot. Part of grappling with that tension, was related to us deciding who should be eligible for more material kind of benefits, like direct cash payments. So we had a 10-month long debate, our first year of the task force, on the community of eligibility, who should be eligible for direct cash payments and some other more material benefits. We enlisted over, several different witnesses to talk about this issue. But in a state like California, we had to actually enlist legal expertise, right? So we enlisted UC Berkeley Law School Dean Erwin Chemerinsky, which I may have talked about when we first had our conversation, who is a constitutional law scholar. And he pretty much gave a dispassionate expert witness testimony, essentially saying he doesn't have a dog in this fight. But he, in his expert testimony, which was in 2022, he predicted the outcome of the Supreme Court case in 2023, where they struck down race-based affirmative action under a diversity rationale. And then he also reminded task force members that we have something called Proposition 209 in this state, and we've had it since the 1990s, which banned race-based considerations in areas of contracting, education, and employment. Just to finish the thought, so Chemerinsky essentially stated, right, in terms of his expertise, his testimony, that, if we wanted a successful reparations program to, circumvent essentially the courts, right? To evade, challenge from the courts, he stated that our reparations eligibility criteria should be targeted towards descendants of persons enslaved in the United States rather than all Blacks at writ large. And then when you read the AB 3121 statute that created the task force, actually race doesn't show up, to be quite honest. It's a bill that is specifically targeted towards descendants of persons enslaved in the United States, but there is a provision in there that states that the task force should study and develop, or must study and develop, reparations proposals for African Americans as a result of the lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery and discrimination on living African Americans. And they define living African Americans as the descendants of persons who were enslaved and then freed due to the 13th Amendment and then made citizens via the 14th Amendment. But then the provision goes on to say, right, we need to study and develop reparation proposals for the lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery and discrimination on living African Americans and on society in California and the United States. And so where the task force landed, right? We obviously stay true to our mandate in recommending reparations proposals for living African Americans, and that are those who are descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. But we took the last part of that provision seriously too, in terms of the society aspect. And so that's where we also recommended racial equity type bills, like one of the bills that are on Governor Newsom's desk right now. SB 1089 that would require grocery stores to notify their community stakeholders when they close in marginalized communities to address food apartheid. Or, the Crown Act, for instance, that's one of the bills that's on his desk, to extend the Crown Act to apply to youth, Black youth, right? Not just descendants of persons enslaved in the United States, but Black youth, so that they're no longer discriminated for wearing their natural hair. And then we also have universal policies in there as well, because we acknowledge the afterlife of slavery impacts all of us in a certain way, but it disproportionately impacts descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. So one of the bills that passed, and that was on the Black Caucus's priority bill package, and because it's a California constitutional amendment, it's not on Newsom's desk for consideration, but it's going to be on the ballot this November. It's ACA 6, but it's Proposition 6. And so if folks vote yes on Proposition 6, that would ban forced labor or slavery in prisons. And that's going to apply to all prisoners, right? Not just descendants of slaves, but white prisoners, Latino prisoners. All prisoners will no longer be forced to work in California state prisons. So in terms of where we landed, I guess you could say compromise, but that's really kind of not the right word. We definitely took serious our mandate to some of the most strongest recommendations in there are targeted towards descendants of slaves, but we also have obviously racial equity bills and universal policies in there as well.
And one of the things that came up during that testimony, I know Dr. Greg Carr, for example, he and Professor Chemerinsky disagreed on whether or not lineage versus race was going to rule the day. And one of the things that was pointed out in the aftermath was, well, if I'm white, but I have ancestors who were enslaved, then I too am going to be chasing my lineage to get access to that reparations package. So sometimes these unintended consequences can have real unintended consequences. Commissioner Moore, it sounds like there is a lot of work left to do, and I'm just grateful for you giving us some time today. And I hope we can call on you in the future to help us understand how this is continuing to evolve in the state of California. I'm seeing a couple of folks who have noted that Gavin Newsom may be seeing a run for himself potentially in 2028 if things don't go well for the Democrats this year. So he may not want to be the governor on record signing off on a reparations package. And so there's a whole lot of rocks to look under as we navigate this space. But as someone who's trying to do this work in the state of New York, I'm looking forward to keeping in touch because your guidance is going to be very helpful. Thank you so much for being with us today. For people who want to connect with you on social or further, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
Yes, thank you so much again, Lurie, for this. This was a great conversation. People can reach me at Kamilah V. Moore across all social media, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Kamilah V as in Victoria, Moore. And then I also have a website, KamilahMoore.com.